Hi, and thanks for watching another instructional video for CSCI 1300. In this video, we will cover functions and how we can build our own functions or call functions that are already built for us. So what is a function? Well, the definition of a function is a sequence of instructions with a name. Some examples of functions you might kind of come across so far in working with C++ include maybe like the POW function, where you pass in two arguments such as a base and an exponent, and it will give you a return value for when you call the function. So you can store whatever POW gives you. Same with the absolute function, ABS, and this will give us the absolute value of whatever we pass in. Another one would be rand, if you wanted to generate a random number up to the largest integer value, which is rand max. Or even main. The main primary function you have been using up to this point is int main. This is a primary starting function for all C++ programs, and it has an integer data type. Functions are basically black boxes. And by black box, we mean we don't necessarily need to know what's going on inside of the function as long as we know how to call it and what to expect when we do. So what would the inputs be and what would the output we expect result in? For instance, if we called POW, we passed in 3 and 2, and we raised 2 to the 3, we would get 8 as a result, because we'd be raising the base 2 to a power of 3 and getting 8 returned to us in the output of the function. Functions can take in inputs, produce an output of some data type. Every function has a data type and must return something of that data type. So you must, when you return a value, it must match the data type of the function. And functions have scope, just like conditional statements, they have brackets attached to them. So the main has its own scope and any other function has its own scope. And you can see that here in our function definition. Note the first line of the function, which involves three different things primarily. The first being the return value or the data type of the function itself. In this example, cube volume is a double type, so we will return a double. The name of the function comes next on the line, and here we're naming the function cube underscore volume. And lastly, we will have to put parentheses after the name of the function for it to be recognized as a function, even if we do not pass parameters. In this example, we do pass parameters. We're passing a double called side length, which is the name of the thing that we are passing in from somewhere else. So when we call this function, we will have to push or pass in some information into the parentheses to represent side length. Here, in the scope of this function, whatever we pass in, whether it is 5.5 or some other value, that will be stored within a variable named side length, and it will be scope specific, so it will only be in this program. One thing to note about functions is that when we pass parameters to functions, they are passed by value, meaning that we make a copy of them in order to use in the scope of the function. So the original value is not directly reassigned a value. So the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump into some code and talk about how this applies to C++. We have two functions here, one called roll dice and one called max value. If I open up roll dice, what you'll see is that basically what we're doing is we're using a random seed. We're generating a random number between 1 and 6. We're storing that into an integer called num. And because roll dice is a function that is an integer data type, we're going to return an integer, and that is what num is. So whatever we get from this result by calling the rand function, we're going to return that in the variable num. So if I have an output, notice that I initialize and declare output on the first line here, and then set output equal to the function call. So when we call roll dice, it's supposed to return a value. When we get to this line and we say output is equal to roll dice, what happens is that the compiler says, well, I'll go to roll dice, I'll generate some output, And when I return here, I will assign whatever comes back from roll dice into output. So whatever value we get from calling roll dice will be stored into variable output. And let's check that out now. Since we're generating a random number, it should be different every time. And you can see here that we rolled a 4. So if we go in here, we generated a number between 1 and 6, stored that into num, returned that through num. That value in num was stored in the roll dice function call, which we then passed to output. So we overwrote output with whatever roll dice comes back with. And if we kept doing this, we would have different outputs every time. So that's a function that requires no parameters. We can call it without passing anything, and we can return something of the correct data type for that function. Now, if we wanted to actually pass parameters, we could do that in, say, something that requires parameters. In this example, we're using a function called maxValue, which takes in 2 integers, a and b, and will return whether a is larger than b or vice versa, and also whether or not they are equal. So let me go ahead and comment out this section and uncomment our next function call. So here what we're doing is we're reusing output from the top of the program, and we're assigning it to a new function call for maxValue. MaxValue is being passed a value of 4 and a value of 3. So we're testing to see whether the left or the right is larger. And when we do this, we notice that the first value is the maximum. 4 is larger than 3. If we were to pass 3 as well, we could also see that we have a condition for that as well. And we've handled that kind of output by just setting return 0 when we have even numbers. That's all for function calls. Thanks and happy coding.